Why? Why do the innocent suffer? Why do my prayers go unanswered? Why can't I see God's will for my life? Well, these are three of the most frequently asked questions that I and others hear, and even sometimes ask myself. And if these questions are of interest to you, please listen up and try to be here over the next couple weeks too, because we'll try to flesh out these questions and come to some kind of deeper understanding of the God who created and who sustains us. See, the world is a beautiful place, isn't it? We can see that everywhere. But it continues to be violent and frightening to many. And America is no longer the safe haven we've come to think and believe it to be. Terror attacks of all kinds are happening more and more frequently, not just in other places anymore, and natural disasters seem to be occurring more frequently everywhere, don't they? For example, on December 26, 2004, the earth shook and the waters rose, and over 227,000 people lost their lives in what was to be recorded as the largest tsunami in known history, and the third largest earthquake recorded by a seismograph. And the world was devastated, and lives were changed forever. And then on April 16, 2007, a gunman fired, killing 32 and injuring 17 others on the campus of Virginia Tech. Some people in this area know personally victims of that tragedy. And on December 14, 2012, right nearby where my brother lives in Connecticut, 20 children under the age of 8 and 6 adults walked into the Sandy Hook Elementary School, never to return to their families. A tragic shooting affected the lives of the people of Newtown, Connecticut, and then ultimately also the lives of many people around the country and the world when we heard about it. And similar tragedies are happening with alarming regularity now, aren't they? Well, we tend to think that these kind of tragedies are happening just in our lifetimes, or that they're becoming much worse. And in a way they are, but really that kind of thinking is short-sighted, however, as we can learn from the Bible. Over 2,000 years ago, as we heard in the gospel reading today, a dreadful tragedy occurred. King Herod put out a decree to kill all the youngest boys in Bethlehem in an effort to destroy the baby who would become the king of the Jews. Herod was afraid of him, and extermination was the easiest way, he figured, to eliminate the threat. See, the death of children, innocent and vulnerable, is cast in the very beginnings of the gospel and the Christmas story. 20 children killed, just like Newtown, Connecticut. It's a similar cry to the one we hear from this early life of Jesus. King Herod ordered children under 2 years old to be killed in the Judean village of Bethlehem when he heard from the Magi that a king of the Jews had been born. And historians estimate that in this tiny village, some 20 children were hacked to death because of this madman who was subservient to Rome, and so he was insecure in his own kingship, and he took it out on them. It's nothing new. So here's a point then where a Christian response begins. What is there to be said when something like this happens? Especially when we celebrate the Christmas story about a coming king who will save and shepherd his flock. Or when we look toward the second coming, which mercifully may be sometime soon. But the Christian story and promise is not a shield protecting us from violence, from suffering or pain. As it rains on the just and unjust, it says, it also hails on the just and the unjust. Current Christian ministers and ministries who promote a pain-free life, if one will only follow Jesus, are just plain wrong and may even be called false teachers. That unfortunately just doesn't happen. Before the Bethlehem massacre, back in the time of Noah, a great flood covered the whole earth and killed everyone. Only 8 people were saved on the ark. Countless numbers were wiped out because of their disobedience. And remember the earthquake that shook the whole earth as Jesus breathed his last breath on the cross. See, we're not living in a time when more bad things are happening. The issue today is that we are hearing about them more quickly and more often because of the media and the internet and their ability to get information out more quickly than before, much more efficiently than by using a stone and a chisel, for example. But God often gets put at the center of the blame game, and sometimes Christians go right along with it and blame him too. Now, I'm not making light of any of these situations because they still bring up questions. Why does God allow suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why doesn't God stop tragedies? Where is God in the midst of all the natural disasters and these tragedies? Why do children suffer? Why, God, do people suffer? Well, it's during tragedies such as these that these questions and others seem to surface more, right? I mean, those who aren't faithful begin asking why right away. Why, if we have a loving God, doesn't he stop bad things from happening? And the faithful get caught up in it too, and begin questioning God too. And these are, in fact, though, good questions to be asking. But we need to be careful, too, because sometimes our typical responses to events such as these do more harm than good for those facing such tragedies. When tragedy strikes, Christians often find themselves immediately defending their faith and defending their God. And oftentimes we use reasons and give answers without really thinking them through. How many times have you said to someone, well, everything happens for a reason? Or how about this one? Have you used this? It must have been the will of God. Well, if you really think about it, neither of those statements are comforting to parents who have just lost a 6-month-old child, or to the parents of a teenager recently killed in an auto accident, or as far as that goes, to anyone. So did you ever think as you answer with one of those statements that you are placing the blame on God? You're also convicting the one who has created humanity and sustained this world for so long. And I have to wonder how God feels when we do that. And yes, he does feel when he's accused and convicted of these kinds of heinous acts. as if it's all his plan, his fault. So if we can't use the old standby answers, what are the answers that we can use to explain these things? Well, I read a book by Adam Hamilton called Why? Making Sense of God's Will. And some things in it made some sense to me. I thought I'd share them. He suggests 3 foundational ideas that will help us reconcile God's goodness with the suffering that we experience. And each of them point back to humanity. See, when God created human beings and declared his work to be good, he set in motion a relationship in which we would need him for everything. That meant that humanity's total dependence would not be on one another, not on material things, and not on anything else, but solely on God. And he gave us dominion over the planet. He put us in charge. And by so doing, he made us responsible for what happens here. And we heard that in today's Old Testament passage from Genesis. We are in charge. We are to rule over the earth, but not alone. God created and put the earth in motion. He put natural laws in place that would keep it fairly predictable. And when God created human beings, he gave us intellect. He gave us a soul and a conscience so that we could handle some of these things. And these gifts are to guide us as we rule over creation and to help us discern right from wrong. God's way of acting here is to use his people with the gifts that they have been given. So he wants to use us in these situations. Then the second foundational idea also has to do with humans. It's called free will. Free will differentiates us from the animals, for example, because we have the ability to know the difference between right and wrong and to make choices in which way to turn and how to act. We can choose God's way or another way. And this is part of our human existence. And the final foundational idea underlies the reason why God needed to send Jesus. He knew we would be predisposed to stray from what is right. And right from the beginning, with Adam and Eve, humans strayed. And this straying away from God, missing the mark, sinning, is what often leads us into trouble, isn't it? Our actions often negatively affect ourselves and affect others too. And Adam and Eve's disobedience is our story too. We find ourselves drawn to do the things that bring us or others pain somehow. And we're easily tempted to stray from God's path down our own way. So the freedom that God intended as our gift also opens us up to suffering. And I don't think we consider the consequences of our decisions enough and how far they flow. What we do may affect not only ourselves and our families, but can ultimately affect every human and even the earth itself sometimes. Adam Hamilton, who I mentioned a minute ago, shares this story. He says, I always thought that when my children reached the age of 18 that I would no longer worry about them. But as they left our home, I found I was worried about them even more, not less. I worry because at times they think they are indestructible. They do things at times that leave me worried sick. Before they left home, I set up certain rules for them. And I learned that I can't control my children. They will be free. And I can't force them to do what I think is in their best interests. Well, just as parents can't take freedom away from their kids when they're no longer living in their home, God doesn't take away our freedom from us either. Nor does He deliver us from the consequences of our actions or from the actions of others. But He does promise to deliver us and sustain us and force good to come from the painful things that we experience. And that is part of the process of redemption, which is a wonderful thing. My Redeemer, come redeeming. So we see that humans have much to do with pain and suffering. But there are other explanations as well. In the case of natural disasters, we tend to forget that during creation, God wrote formulas and set in motion patterns and processes for the earth so that it could exist and support life in this universe. In the case of earthquakes, for example, we've learned that it is necessary for the earth to release heat from its center. And in order to do this, the earth must move and shift. And sometimes this movement creates beautiful mountains, while other times it causes disastrous earthquakes and tsunamis. Yes, God created the way the earth functions, but He did not do it with the purpose of harming humanity. No, people have learned of these processes, and yet they continue to live by fault lines and along the coastlines. That's their choice, not God's. We have to remember that God is the source of all life, of created systems, of humanity. He gave us free will to choose and some control through our understanding and decision-making abilities. And then there's sickness. Sickness is not God's way. As Jesus walked this earth, He healed the sick. He didn't make them sicker. Unfortunately, though, just as there are things within the earth that can cause destruction, there are things on this earth that can make us sick. It's not God's will, but rather it's the outcome of living here in a world of fallen creation, a creation that has been altered and deteriorated through our decisions and actions. So we get sick. So, what does the Christmas story, the gospel, have to say to us then? Well, its very beginning was shaped by the massacre of little children. Think about it. While the uniqueness of the Christian message is that the God of creation became human, He did so within the world of deep human tragedy in which He was raised. All around Him He saw it. And Jesus is no mythological icon floating in a mirage of wishful thinking like many people seem to think. His world was of real flesh and blood. Jesus' understanding of the inner brokenness of Bethlehem, the inner brokenness of Newtown, goes to the very core of who He is. The kingdom that His kingship brought is gritty and real, and it reaches into our little lives. Jesus is present in moments of grief, when tidal waves catch us by surprise and the ground beneath us shakes and people start shooting. In such times, not surprisingly, we are more open to spiritual insights and comfort, aren't we? Many people who don't go to church suddenly find themselves going to gather around an altar and sing songs of solace and hear words of His peace, because our spirits long for a link with God and a way to transcend our tragedies. And it is here that the tearing of the human soul is mediated and medicated by the balm of His presence. And these broken hearts will mend, yet they will always be scarred. And indeed, the longer we live, the more our beings are covered with wounds and scars, some self-inflicted, others through no fault of our own. But the Bible, from cover to cover, is a history full of complaints and suffering. It is not about a Pollyanna life. Just look at Job, David and the Psalms, the book of Lamentations, and especially Jesus. The one who gave it all for God's children at the end of His life was not celebrated. He was crucified. And His followers, the disciples, were not exempt from suffering, and they were Jesus' closest friends. One committed suicide. One was imprisoned and had boiling oil poured over him. And the rest all died for their faith. So Christianity does not promise that we will not suffer. But what it does promise is that suffering will never have the final word, and that we will never suffer alone. That's good news. Jesus Christ, God's only Son, suffered far worse than any of us ever will suffer. He knows about it. He's not happy about it. But tragedy is a part of the Bible's overarching story, that it is not the end of life. And beyond the confirmation that life goes on is the essential promise of the kingdom that as life begins, eternity is etched into its essence. From our very birth, we have eternal life. And life is not all there is to living. Death is not all there is to dying. So to hurting hearts everywhere, the gospel is a present and healing story in the midst of sorrow, and more people need to hear it. And it is a hopeful promise of living forever with God in paradise. That is our hope, and that is our greatest gift. Again, we need to share it more. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.